Perfect. I think we've got a really great audience here, and it's my pleasure as the executive committee member of the UCSF-Stanford CERSI. I'm Kuldev Singh. I have the privilege of introducing Dr. Chris Almond today, who's going to talk about pediatric medical devices, challenges, and the search for solutions. We all know this is a huge problem. Not enough attention is paid towards the processes involved in getting devices approved for children. Chris has been really at the forefront of this area. He's a professor of pediatrics and chief of the heart failure and cardiac anticoagulation services at Lucile Packard Children's Hospital at Stanford. He has also, besides his medical training at University of Connecticut and residency and fellowship training at Boston Children's, he also completed a medical device fellowship at FDA in the Division of Cardiovascular Devices. He also has a MPH in statistics and epidemiology from Harvard, the Harvard School of Public Health. So he's extremely well trained and very focused on making a difference in this arena. Chris is going to present, and then hopefully we'll have time for some Q&A afterwards. Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hey, thank you very much, and really want to thank everyone for joining in today to talk about a topic that I think is a passion for a lot of us, and I really think a growing number of people, which gives us optimism about addressing some of the challenges. So I just want to point out that I have no financial disclosures, do have some grant support. I do serve on the executive committee for the industry-funded VALOR trial, which is variciguate pediatric heart failure. And I will talk about off-label use of devices, and this is principally because there are a large number of drugs and devices that are routinely used off-label in children, which is one of the reasons we're discussing this. So I'd like to do in the next 35, 40 minutes is to present the case of a child who illustrates what I think is really the scope and the urgency of the pediatric medical device problem, talk a little bit about one of the strategies to lower costs, the adaptive platform trial, and some kind of interesting ideas. This is one of the CERSI projects that we've been working on for the last couple of years. Then to talk about the broader context of financial barriers facing pediatric device development, and to brainstorm some potential solutions. You might hear some slightly crazy ideas here. These are mostly unedited suggestions so far. And then to talk about one last problem, which is racial bias in commercially available pulse oximeters. So for those of you who may not have kind of felt the kind of impact of this pediatric medical device problem, I think this case really illustrates it well. So an 18-year-old boy with complex heart disease is admitted to the cardiac ICU for severe heart failure, and it generally is getting worse despite a ventilator and several continuous infusions. His vital organs begin to fail. To keep him stable enough for heart transplant, he undergoes placement of a Berlin heart pump, the only FDA-approved heart pump for smaller children. But unlike adult pumps that are fully implantable, magnetically levitated, and allow hospital discharge, the Berlin heart pump sits outside the body, is relatively heavy at 97 kilograms, and is really not terribly safe for hospital discharge. Requires close inpatient monitoring. So this just gives you a little bit of an idea of kind of the current standard in adults. This is the HeartMate 3, and here you can see that it has lev technology, relatively recent stuff. It's fully implantable. There's a small power cord that exits the body wall and is a potential site for infection. The driver and battery are highly portable and dischargeable. And this compares to the current Berlin heart for kids, which is using 1960s pulsatile blood pump technology. The pump sits outside the body and has two relatively large blood cannulas that allow blood to go from the heart into the pump and back. The risk of stroke with these devices is higher and is generally neutralizable only with a continuous infusion of an anticoagulant. And the driver is not terribly portable. So if you look at life on the HeartMate 3, this is one of the promotional videos from Abbott. You can see this is what it looks like. And this is a picture of one of the girls that's in our institution who's on the pump. And you can see she's got her pump here. And then this is the driver, kind of the pink driver, which is pretty famous from our group. So if you look at the gap in technology, if you look along this line, this is the adult evolution of technology for ventricular assist devices going from outside the body to inside, from pulsatile to continuous flow to fully magnetically levitated. And now there's even some wireless concepts that are out there. And you can see the Berlin heart is still kind of in this 1960s technology and hasn't really progressed. The Jarvik trial was suspended recently during its feasibility study because of manufacturer financial reasons. And this is kind of a relatively good example of some of the challenges. So Kenson remains hospitalized until he receives his heart transplant. He does well on his Berlin heart and he's ultimately discharged. But then 6 months later, he develops complete heart block requiring insertion of a pacemaker. Now, there is no FDA-approved pacemaker made specifically for infants and toddlers. The only option is to implant a large adult-sized pacemaker into the child, which is harder to implant and carries more risks. Unlike adults where the pacemaker is inserted in the shoulder during a short procedure under local anesthesia, children must be put under general anesthesia so that the cardiac surgeon can open both the abdomen and the chest to insert the pacemaker. Here's a quick visual. You can see that the pacemaker in an adult goes under the shoulder. The leads that actually attach to the heart are snaked through the veins. So this is a transvenous system, and they anchor into the heart here. So this is basically a relatively typical adult pacemaker. For an infant and toddler, there is no miniaturized version. So basically the can of the device is inserted into the abdomen, and then the chest is open so that the leads, which can't be snaked through the vessels, are placed on the outside of the heart. So this is a much more involved procedure. It requires opening both the chest and the abdomen. It requires general anesthesia and is higher risk. And of course, kids like this can easily outgrow their equipment as the leads stretch and perhaps explant themselves from the heart. Unfortunately, because it's a much more complicated procedure, it leads to severe bleeding and inflammation, and he becomes unstable with severe hypotension. So this requires that he's placed onto ECMO, or extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. This is a heart-lung machine known to most of the world as full life support. But despite its use for over 50 years, ECMO has never been FDA approved or cleared in children as a standalone system. Some of the parts have been cleared, but most of this is FDA cleared for adults, not for use for weeks and months, but just for 6 hours support. And because all use is off-label, no careful comparative studies have been performed to figure out which one is really the best. So the current state of the art is that every hospital uses a slightly different circuit based on their local experience, which they kind of assemble like an erector set, somewhat jerry-rigging it with whatever parts and fasteners they have in stock from their bypass equipment. Thus, there's enormous unexplained center variation in ECMO devices that is anything but evidence-driven. So this is one of the problems of off-label use. This is a ECMO device for anyone who hasn't seen one before. It's basically kind of a large Frankenstein machine that are assembled together. There are some standalone versions and there are some that are improvised. And this is kind of the current standard of care in the United States. Following his pacemaker and complications and support with ECMO, his kidneys start to fail, requiring dialysis. Now, because there is no FDA-approved dialysis device for children under 10 kilograms, an adult-sized dialysis circuit must be used. This generally means that dialysis cannulas are too large for the neck vessels, the flow rate is below specifications, and the amount of priming blood for this circuit leads to a lot of inflammation. So the lack of devices often force children's hospitals to truly improvise. And I almost played a video, but I realized I was going to run out of time. This was a video of a nurse at the bedside who was improvising, trying to figure out how to prevent an air embolus from entering the child's circulation. And she had kind of jerry-rigged up a series of filters and things to do it. But it just gave you a quick sense that a lot of this is really being done improvisationally at the bedside, not just by clinicians, but by many bedside nurses. So there have been an enormous number of efforts to try to fix the pediatric medical device problem. There have been legislative efforts to try to simplify the approval pathways, allowing pediatric devices to generate a profit, allowing use of real-world data, efforts to revise reimbursement for devices in clinical trials so that they're covered. There was a wonderful meeting led by Vasum Paris in 2018, bringing together a lot of stakeholders to have some discussions about how to fix the problem. And there's been investment in grants, both from the NIH, but also from the Food and Drug Administration through the Pediatric Device Consortium, as well as the Orphan Product Program that's run by Kathy Needleman. Unfortunately, there really hasn't been much of a change over the last 10 or 15 years. This is data from Bosum showing the relatively low rate of pediatric device approvals. So one of our first projects was, can we find a way to make clinical trials less expensive for industry, more efficient to lower the barriers to entry? And the focus of this was an adaptive platform trial and how it might be potentially one way to approach the problem. So this was our first, one of our first CERSI projects, and we used ECMO as a real-world illustration. So one of the biggest costs to bring a device to market is a clinical trial. It can be $10 to $30 million, 5 to 10 years to run. This is an enormous disincentive for industry trying to bring a device to a small market. And even if the manufacturer can attract the funds for clinical trial, some work by Florence Bourgeois and others have shown that many pediatric trials fail to enroll or complete because the disease is rare and the population is heterogeneous. So we wanted to explore the advantages and disadvantages of using an adaptive platform trial and then to illustrate it using ECMO. So we convened a group of clinical trial experts in pediatric cardiology for a series of 4 two-hour sessions to consider the merits of an APT. Now, none of the traditional trialists in pediatric cardiology had any direct APT experience. We first learned about the APT, its benefits relative to conventional trials, and then we ended up choosing ECMO because it's a very device-rich therapy. You can see it has very high mortality and high adverse event rates. And of course, it's never been FDA cleared as a standalone system for children. Under the leadership of Dr. Roger Lewis and Juliana Tolles, they basically asked the group to design as an exercise the outlines of an APT for ECMO, which we did using a modified Delphi process. The goals of the exercise were to do it so that it would generate the regulatory data needed to get ECMO devices cleared efficiently, but also to entice hospital participation. Not to say that a regulatory trial of an ECMO device wouldn't draw crowds, but we thought that if we dangled over it a series of really compelling scientific questions, that it would really drive interest in participation enrollment, which is really the single biggest challenge for pediatric trials. This was our panel of collaborators. These were clinical collaborators. We were working with the FDA, but these meetings were largely clinical. And you can see it's kind of got a list of who's who in clinical trials in pediatric cardiology: Jane Neuberger, Marie Steiner, Paul Monagle in anticoagulation, Michael Gaze, Jessica Copeland was a parent advocate whose son unfortunately died on ECMO here at Stanford. Stroke specialists, Juliana and Roger. So it was really a great group to work with. So conventional clinical trials can be costly, time-consuming, and inefficient, and that's being said by a group of people who really believe in them. And that is partly because the trial infrastructure is designed de novo for each trial. That is, it's planned, organized, funded, work on recruiting sites, getting patients enrolled, the data are analyzed, and this can easily take 10 to 12 years. And then the next trial comes along where you repeat all of these steps from scratch, duplicating effort with no economies of scale. And secondly, pediatric trials tend to enroll slowly, not only because they're rare, but also because there's marked heterogeneity of the patient population. If you just think for a moment, a child at 3 kilos is very different from an adolescent at 90 kilos, and there's a 30-fold difference in the size. So that's just one dimension of the heterogeneity. So to draw isolated inferences about device performance, typically traditional trials exclude patients to identify a homogeneous cohort. An example is the Berlin Heart IDE trial. Only 1 in 4 patients was actually eligible for the primary inclusion criteria. A third challenge is that trials are limited to answering one primary question, though many relevant questions exist. So each child with a rare disease contributes data to only one primary medical question. So for example, to reduce the risk of stroke on ECMO, one might compare two anticoagulation regimens, such as heparin and bival, but many other questions are relevant. Which ECMO device is best? How many connectors? Which device parameters, flow, speed, pressure impact the risk of clot formation? What is the blood count and the viscosity of the blood? And what level of sedation is optimal if bleeding is triggered often by patient morbidity? And then lastly, trial depends on fixed a priori assumptions that can lead to a failed trial if those assumptions are wrong. So this can lead to a failed trial, and that can either be that it doesn't enroll or that you end up with a negative result and you're really not sure whether it was underpowered or whether actually there was no difference in terms of the effect. So this would, example of ECMO of a traditional trial would be to design it, get funding, complete IRB and contracts. You'd find a homogeneous population, let's say kids under 2 years on VA ECMO with a specific circuit with heart failure as their indication, but you're excluding the, probably 3/4 of the kids who are actually receiving ECMO. Typically, they're randomized in one-to-one fashion. There are 2 treatment arms that are typically fixed, and then the endpoint is assessed. And of course, again, if the assumptions are wrong, then you can end up with a failed trial. So what is an adaptive platform trial? Well, an APT is a sustainable platform for running prospective trials designed to evaluate multiple medical therapies simultaneously using a common cohort of patients. Treatment arms may be discontinued if less effective and can be replaced by new treatments as they become available. Superior arms are retained and can become the new standard of care, almost like a round-robin tournament where the best therapies keep advancing forward. A single control group for multiple treatment arms is a key source of an adaptive platform trial's efficiency. Generally, few patients are excluded. Instead, all patients are enrolled, but into pre-specified strata. And then they're analyzed on the back end to determine if the cohort has a similar response to therapy or entirely different, either in magnitude or direction. The randomization ratio is not fixed, and this is largely to improve the efficiency of trials so that patients are randomized to where information is needed the most. It also tends to have the effect that randomized trials are randomized subjects more often to better performing therapies. So there is a human subjects benefit as well, which is attractive for vulnerable populations. And in terms of the efficiency, for some people who remember old standardized tests where you sat down with a pencil for a couple of days and completed your boards and then knew where you're doing it in front of the computer, the computer can send you a question that only 10% people get right. And if you get it right, and then it assigns you a question that only 1 in 100 get right, and you happen to get it right, and that's repeated twice, in 3 questions, that test has probably figured out with a high degree of significance that you're not going to fail that test. And this is compared to taking questions for 2 days to try to dial in a score. So there's an enormous amount of efficiency that's potential if there's a response adaptive randomization. This table just kind of summarized the traditional and adaptive trials. I don't think there's much else that's here that's said, so we'll just skip to the next. So how might an ECMO APT look? Well, collaborators decided that there were 2 key ingredients. One, we needed to find some way to really interest sites and patients in enrollment. And then secondly, to get FDA grade data on ECMO circuit performance. And one of the limitations here is that most sites, because there isn't evidence to support the circuit they use, there's a lot of, shall we say, religion in that it was a case or 2 that really led them to use or construct circuits in a particular way, also admixed with business agreements with that particular hospital. So to drive interest would be choosing very compelling clinical questions and the big matchups, the marquee matchups that people kind of wanted to see that would drive interest were anticoagulation strategy, when to transfuse patients with red blood cells, and the deepness of sedation. And then the only practical way to standardize ECMO circuits for FDA evaluation was to offer 3 standardized circuits where each side could choose one. So this was looking empirically at the most commonly used circuits and then presenting the top 3 where people could kind of sign up for combo number 1, combo number 2, like you might do at McDonald's or Wendy's, where there are essentially certain combinations that are offered. So would non-randomized data be sufficient for pediatric ECMO? And this is where Nicole Ibrahim and Nicole Gillette and others were really helpful in allowing Peter Alexander and myself to kind of understand the regulatory history of ECMO. And suffice it to say that as a class 2 device, this would not be hard to do. Unlike class 3 devices that might require a randomized trial, class 2 devices typically can be cleared based on showing substantial equivalence to a predicate device. The one challenge is that without a standalone predicate device that's approved, there really isn't a predicate for pediatric ECMO at the present time. Until then, the final order itself, which was a rule that came up about ECMO regulation, can be used as the predicate device. So this is what it kind of looks like. Compared to the other one, all patients essentially would be enrolled in the trial. This would be without respect to whether it was cardiac or respiratory support. Excuse me, elective cannulation or cannulation in the setting of cardiopulmonary resuscitation. Patients would then be randomized to anticoagulation strategy, to a red cell transfusion threshold, and to a sedation strategy. They would then pick one of the 3 devices that were non-randomized. That was based on site selection. And this is how maybe one patient would work. So they would basically, the first patient came along and would be randomized, let's say, to bivalve, to transfusion to a fixed hemoglobin target, to light sedation, and they would get their ECMO circuit. The second patient might be randomized to heparin, to transfuse to clinical indication, to do heavy sedation, and then the non-randomized circuit would be chosen, and so on. All of this would then be analyzed, and you would start to see patterns. There's some combinations of these led to better outcomes and some did not. And this would alter the randomization ratio so that patients were assigned to more effective therapies and also therapies where the value of information was much better. So let's say one arm had very narrow standard deviation. You wouldn't need lots of observations in that arm before you had a pretty good fix on its variance, whereas something with a large standard deviation might need more observations in order to define its variation. Some arms can be eliminated as new treatments become available, new arms are added, and then there's a global score that kind of reflects the net benefit of all of these, and we chose the functional status score. This is a detail of lots of the arms and therapies that people wanted to try in this trial. And this is the functional status score that essentially serves as the endpoint. And this is one of the cooler things that we learned from Roger and Juliana about this desirability of outcome ranking. And this is one of the coolest kind of ideas I've heard of in a while, where you're basically simultaneously trying to optimize 2 things. One is having the highest functional status, but also achieving that in the least amount of ICU time. So you basically are scored on both of these dimensions to prioritize not only the highest functional status, but also doing it with the least amount of medical care time. We did a kind of a quick and dirty analysis looking at the relative cost of running the same 2-arm 9 trials versus an adaptive platform trial, where the net benefit was estimated with, of course, many assumptions, $100 million versus $43 million. What I found even more interesting was that this would be completed not in 7.2 years time, but 2 years time. And that could be much more attractive to industry if they were bringing their wares to a perpetual platform trial rather than designing one on their own. So just as a conclusion here, adaptive trials, we felt could increase the efficiency of evidence generation for devices, could lower incremental costs. This could be one important tool in the broader goal to improve evidence generation more cost efficiently. and could be attractive to industry. And this could either be as a standalone or in kind of a one-stop shopping network of children's hospitals, akin to the ShipMD, that has kind of been a concept that's been making its way around our community. So we've written the manuscript. It's actually currently in review within FDA. We hope to hear back soon. Interestingly, this project has led to quite a bit of growing enthusiasm within our community about the idea of actually setting up an ECMO APT. It's been discussed at several conferences, which has kind of increased the buzz, and discussions are underway about a specific clinical protocol manuscript to flesh this out a little bit more. There are several ECMO conventional trials running right now. They're running into some of the problems that we described. And so I think that's also helping to convince people that there might be a better way. And of course, we really enjoyed working with the FDA on this project and others. This is the manuscript. You can see the FDA authors who are listed here, and hopefully we'll hear back shortly. I just wanted to again thank Vastum. He was really the person who was the kind of origin story for this, as the conversation we had about doing this. Peter Alexander was my kind of crime and partner, Roger Lewis and Juliana, the FDA team, the clinical collaborators for the Delphi process, Selena Gonzalez, the research manager here, and the UCSF-Stanford team. So I'd like to move next to the broader financial barriers. This was an extension that we realized we were thinking about the clinical trial components, but there were many others. And we ultimately held a think tank in DC in May. So all of this that I'm presenting here is kind of fresh information that hasn't been really filtered very much. But as we know, there's been a longstanding market failure in pediatric medical devices that leads to serious inequalities in healthcare for infants and children. The origins of the market failure are complex and encompass a broad range of stakeholders, but essentially stem from the fact that the cost to develop devices is high and the market is tiny relative to adult markets. So we sought to recruit a broad group of experienced and insightful stakeholders to help us identify the financial barriers to pediatric device development and brainstorm some creative solutions. So we focused first on market-based financial barriers, mostly looking at return on investment. How could we either lower the cost of development or to increase the market size, which would potentially help with revenue. And then we looked at non-market or policy financial barriers. Here we mostly looked at the current legislation for drugs, devices, and reimbursement, and tried to imagine how we might kind of wave a wand and what would we change about them to essentially see if we could improve them to help overcome many of the problems that still exist. So we convened a one-day think tank outside DC. We had stakeholders with 2 parents, 3 industry representatives, 2 finance representatives, 4 FDA representatives, 1 NIH representative, 1 from Medicare, 1 from Medicaid. California Medicaid was the state that was included, 2 health policy experts, 4 clinicians, and I think we also had a round of wine late in the day that helped people to generate even more creative ideas. The stakeholders then reviewed data on the current state of pediatric device development and the current initiatives. We then had a market-based discussion followed by a non-market-based discussion. And then I should really note that for this brainstorming exercise, all ideas were, no ideas, I should say, were considered out of bounds. That is, even the bad or impossible ideas, none were rejected. I don't know if anyone likes reading the rejected cartoons from the New Yorker, but what I'm going to run through is a list of ideas, and some you might cringe at or think are just not possible. The whole idea here is to start with a total set of ideas. And I just want to mention that none of these ideas presented represent the official views of any organization, the FDA, NIH, CMS, Battelle, Duke, Oppenheimer, Stanford, Boston Children's, anyone. And in fact, I think we all agreed to kind of protect the ideas, the identities of people who generated ideas. This was the team that came together. And you can see it had family advocates, clinicians, economic policy. Bina from Duke came. investment, industry, reimbursement. Amy Bassano was wonderful from Medicare. Michael Freeman was Medicaid. Jeffrey Geppert, who is just sensational in all things and a great thinker, was there. And of course, the FDA. So market-based things. How do we kind of lower or address the cost barriers? Looking at all the phases of device development, it was pointed out that animal models tend to be very expensive and limited applicability, especially for GLPs, can be $50,000 or more. And of course, you not only need good implant care, but also post-operative care. So either a clinical intensivist or a veterinarian, this becomes very expensive to do. So some of the suggestions were using simulation to reduce the cost and time of bench and animal testing and possibly clinical trials. There's a lengthy period of negotiation with FDA for animal and type, especially around pediatric devices. So there was a suggestion to create a set of pediatric standards for animal testing and models to reduce time and cost of negotiating from scratch each time. Conventional trials are expensive and time consuming. People had thought about doing registry trials, which has been successful in pediatrics, creating an APT, of course, or skipping the high-priced CROs that seems to be a cottage industry out there and run a trial in-house with 1 to 2 experienced hires. Some of the people in our group had done that and had been much more affordable. There's huge variability in registry quality for use as real-world evidence with missing data, missing variables, they're not adjudicated. And a lot of these problems tend to bias the results toward the null. So if you're looking to show substantial equivalence, the thumb is somewhat on the scale for things not showing any difference. So could we create a set of standards for registries to meet to be certified to run regulatory trials in terms of data quality? There are just so many out there and they really span the spectrum. Ensure Medicare and Medicaid don't cover device or trial related expenses and are ambiguous about these. This would be really helpful to create clear and transparent systems of coverage for pediatric device trials. And high quality advice is oftentimes limited to select consultants. So a good device may actually fail primarily due to the lack of insider savvy with a lot of these challenges. So there was some suggestion to create a US center-based pediatric device innovation forum akin to the Israeli Innovation Center, where high quality device is easily accessible and freely shared. Another issue is revenue, and unlike rare disease drugs that can charge a higher price, rare disease devices tend not to. They tend to just replicate the billing of whatever the adult device is that can disincentivize pediatric devices for rare diseases. So should we allow or perhaps create a social expectation that a good pediatric device, which is maybe harder to design, may charge more than the equivalent adult device? If you had a thimble-sized transvenous pacemaker suitable for an infant, would it be legitimate to charge more for that to recoup the investment cost? And then how do we grow the market, and which also includes the number of children for trials? Focusing on the US alone is adding a restriction that may not be necessary. Should we be recruiting international patients? This is more important as OUS data has improved. OUS data are increasingly welcomed for regulatory decisions. Could we consider convening a meeting with the major international regulatory authorities to streamline international submissions for pediatric medical devices? Because patients with rare disease are scattered very widely geographically, could we start to learn more about decentralized clinical trial designs as digital health technology and telehealth capabilities have improved, particularly in the wake of the COVID pandemic? Patients are heterogeneous, so most are excluded from clinical trials. This is where APTs may be of benefit. In the US, many patients with a disease may be hidden from the walls of a center. This is where registry-based studies can be especially helpful. There was a great example of the HeartMate 3, which is an adult VAD. Labeling was expanded to kids using Action Registry data, which is an excellent registry that's adjudicated and has a lot of those nice fine touches to make it high quality data. And then, of course, the best way to open up a market is really to have a disruptive technology. If we just made pediatric devices significantly safer, easier said than done, then the ultimately way to grow the market is to start implanting in less sick patients with a milder phenotype. And of course, the best would be to make miniaturized devices that could also support adults. This would open up the adult market through innovation and miniaturization. What about limited investments? So grant opportunities are few and don't really benefit from the market value for something that actually becomes viable commercially. So could we create a set of grant systems a little bit like the Gates Foundation, where the granting agency can become a stakeholder in the royalties if the therapy is commercially viable, or as the Gates Foundation oftentimes does, simply requires that the grant is paid back so that that money can be recycled for yet another grant, allowing to stretch the grant dollar. Companies often purchase a technology later that they abandon either because it's too expensive or it's too cheap and would undercut sales of their own devices. I think something was published recently in the New York Times on this issue for drugs. So could we create a law or exercise a law that maybe the NIH has to allow granting agencies to claw back patent or licensed technology if it's buried by a company to allow it to be commercialized? Companies oftentimes don't work together, but could in mutually beneficial ways. One of the ideas that Suraj Kalia from Oppenheimer suggested was to create an industry-led consortium. He thought about 20% government involvement was right to accelerate R&D and strategy. And this would both defray costs, but also share risk to improve ROI. And then there's untapped public or social benefit for companies. This was an idea that Suraj and many people really loved, which was to somehow create social benefit to companies that invest in pediatric devices through a seal of approval, or, if you got a grade from the American Academy of Pediatrics as a device-friendly company, that might attract certain investors. Off-label use is, of course, a huge problem because it's almost standard operating procedure so anywhere. Could we tie reimbursement to data collection? Could we somehow mandate industry to perform off-label studies where device use in children has become the standard of care? I know mandates aren't terribly appealing to industry support groups, but there may be select places where that could potentially be negotiated. Data on off-label use are not readily available. This is where registries could step in to do more of this. And then there are many instances of devices that are used but never show up even in registry. And this is where Harlan Krumholtz and others have been working and actually implementing a unique device ID number to essentially track every single use of a device. This would grow the market as well. And companies could potentially be responsible for a minimum data set on device use that's not reported to registries through this tracking number. What about non-market barriers that are out there? To kind of run through these quickly, how might we leverage existing device legislation to improve it? Application fees have been eliminated for pediatric devices that are solely for pediatrics. Could that be expanded to any device with a pediatric labeling indication? Though many people mention that eliminating applications fees may not be quite potent enough to a stimulus to draw industry in. Grant funding opportunities created for pediatric devices still relatively limited in scale compared to drugs. So could there be a public-private partnership? Could a standalone or network like the ShipMD concept be workable here? Could we increase OPD funding to support specifically pediatric device applications? Those are very precious dollars and are stretched across lots of different therapeutic categories. The Breakthrough Device Program applies really only to PMA applications, not to humanitarian or pediatric pathways. So could this be amended to include pediatric devices with humanitarian designations seeking HDE approval? And then expansion of real-world data to support regulatory decisions. It may be that nested registry trials would, especially if they were blinded with respect to adjudication, could overcome bias and confounding that's seen in many registries. What could we learn from drug legislation? There's clearly no equivalent of a 6-month patent exclusivity to entice industry to develop pediatric devices. And this is really because there isn't a framework for kind of generics in the same way that there is for drugs. So could we identify an equally potent incentive, such as a major tax break, de-risking investments, offering a higher device reimbursement rate, which reportedly has been done in Australia with some success, or providing a company with a path to access breakthrough speed if it secures pediatric approval. PREA also allows FDA to require that companies perform studies in children. And there's really no obvious analogous legislation here. This is not always popular among trade advocacy groups, but some maybe minor or incremental requirements, like asking them to define the lower or smallest subject that could be supported with a device in terms of anatomic fit, physiology, or response to growth through stimulation. And in some ways, there are mandates that already exist for post-approval studies. So could FDA leverage this authority to almost require a pediatric post-approval study where any significant off-label use is expected? Could that become a little bit more formalized or expected for companies? And then what about reimbursement? Perhaps one of the most important limitations of Medicare is that CMS doesn't oftentimes make coverage decisions for pediatric medical devices, which can undermine insurance coverage and private payers that tend to follow suit. So could CMS be required to recruit pediatric experts to make these coverage decisions? Could we create a rule where the FDA coverage recommendation would stand if Medicare declined to make a ruling on coverage? Could we expand Medicare to allow children with life-threatening illnesses to be eligible for Medicare, similar to pediatric dialysis, where those patients are reimbursed through Medicare channels rather than state Medicaid services, or require CMS to cover housing-related costs, as many families must travel enormous distances to reach trial sites? You can imagine this was one of the type of recommendations that most of the clinicians would not have seen, but was strongly recommended by the 2 family representatives that were there. And of course, people have sold their homes and other things because of travel costs related to this sort of thing. Much of the recommendations for the ACA would be to standardize the language so that devices are mentioned on the same footing as drugs and biologics. So anywhere IND is used, perhaps IDE should be mentioned as well. When you look through a lot of the language of some of these reimbursement rules, and you'll see that there's that the devices really don't get quite the same coverage as they really ought to. And some people thought that it would be possible to justify higher reimbursement for pediatric devices because of the quality argument, and there's some precedent for this in Europe. And lastly, what about Medicaid, which is really where the vast majority of health insurance coverage comes for children. And each state Medicaid system is siloed, as people know. And makes it difficult for a company to know whether their device is going to be covered in different states. This is a huge problem. One of the most exciting things that we kind of came across, and this was really from Amy Bassano from Medicare, is that she forwarded this letter on the CMS letter to state Medicaid agencies, which really for the first time seeks to address this variability by essentially mandating coverage for qualifying clinical trials. If this does have teeth, this could be a significant development for pediatrics, especially those who are covered by Medicaid. And we'd almost love to see something like this letter converted actually into law. Could we create a network of like-minded states willing to work together to make shared coverage decisions, obviating the need for state-by-state negotiations? And then one other thing about qualifying clinical trials, a point was made that generally that's something that's FDA approved, IRB approved, and federally funded. but do we really need it to be limited to federal funded trials if industry really needs this help too? So could we eliminate federal funding criteria to make pediatric device trials eligible for coverage if they are at least FDA approved and IRB approved? So we submitted an abstract to World Congress in late August. We have a manuscript that we're working on. And of course, because most of us have no experience in legislation and that sort of thing, we plan to work with some experts in that area. And we'd love any ideas. I think this is the group that really worked on this. Again, Vasum was spectacular in helping us build out these ideas. And this was the think tank. I'm just going to take a few minutes because I want to take time for questions to talk about racial bias and commercially available pulse oximeters. This was a CERSI-funded clinical trial seeking to answer the bias question. There's a great group of people. This is the Stanford team, the spot bias trial, as we've come to call it. And the main issue is that pulse oximetry is widely used to determine whether a patient is adequately oxygenated, but studies suggest that pulse oximeters systematically overestimate the true oxygen saturation in patients with darker skin pigment. This error or bias puts patients with darker skin pigment at considerable risk by failing to detect important levels of hypoxemia that drive critical treatment decisions like medication usage, hospital admission, even ICU transfer and intubation. A number of retrospective studies have been done that have a series of limitations, like using race and ethnicity as a proxy, analyzing paired oximetry values that may be separated in time, lack documentation of perfusion status, and sometimes are using older oximeters. And this has been in the New England Journal, in JAMA. So with the FDA, we felt these could be addressed by doing a prospective study where we measured all of these things, used contemporary oximeters, and made paired measurements that were at steady state. And ultimately, I'm just going to jump through this. One of the theories is that it's really the low perfusion index, especially in patients with darker skin pigment, that are most effective. And so this is a very testable hypothesis to do. So basically, we've ended up enrolling children with an arterial line. We're trying to cover the range of oxygen saturations. This is the fastest I think we've ever put together a trial with funding with FDA, got an IRB approved, got contracts done, got the first patient enrolled, and just a week ago, we completed enrollment of the 154 patients. They represent a wide range of ages and sizes and congenital heart disease. Here are some of the preliminary data. We had a variety of challenges, and I will only highlight one that I think was really important. That is, let's see, that enrollment was really skewed toward patients with lighter skin pigment, away from the very population that is most important. So we started oversampling in certain populations. We studied our consent failures. We added Michelle Williams at Stanford, who's an expertise in minority recruitment, and we're looking at adding Oakland, CHOP, or Atlanta as another site. We've just had a DMC that has increased the sample size, so we're looking forward to completing the study. And I just want to mention that all of these projects really support the goal of improving health by finding new ways to evaluate safety and effectiveness of products. And that's really the central mission of the CERSI project. And we're really pleased. And thank you very much. At least there's a few minutes left for discussion if I haven't exhausted you with that whirlwind tour.
Well, Chris, thank you for an absolutely inspirational talk that really captures the spirit of CERSI in a way that I don't think anyone can match. Really, the amount of the volume and the quality of your work is truly tremendous. We are open for Q&A. Chris, I'll start off. And please send questions. We have about I think about 10 minutes. Chris, just wondering what role large nonprofits, philanthropic organizations like, say, the American Heart Association or the American Academy of Pediatrics can play in getting money. If they have, especially if they have foundation arms, can they allow you to get money where to focus on pediatric medical devices in areas where such money is desperately needed to move projects forward that probably cannot move forward with just private money?
Yeah, no, what a great question. I've heard several people say, Tim Nelson up in at the Mayo Clinic has said that if you really look at philanthropy, the amount of money and funds that's available actually dwarfs what's even available from NIH and the American Heart Association. And a lot of it is really just trying to find the right investors who really would like to do it. I still have a hard time imagining that because the resources that are available to NIH and AHA and others are so vast, but it does make a very good point. I do think that thinking about new ways for grants that could be repaid back or there could be a royalty stake in the outcome is one of the most intriguing ideas that I've heard. And since it would only take a few of these where there was some return on investment, I wonder whether we just need to think a little bit differently, a little bit like the Gates Foundation in terms of raising funds where those royalties could be fed back to create more grants.
Yeah, it'd be great to see products developed for children where actually they could then be used in adults, and that would provide the revenue to support the continuation of children first for novel therapies. Just kind of switch the paradigm completely. But I think it makes a lot of sense. Another question I want to ask you is whether you're familiar with the TAP program. I don't know if you know of this program that Jeff Shuren launched last year at CDRH. I think it was last year, which is a total product lifecycle advisory pilot to help, in his words, have Sherpas who help you. I think it was Doug Kelly or maybe it was Doug's words, that to help Sherpas sort of take people from the idea stage all the way through the innovation cycle to meet all of these challenges, including regulatory review, and whether there could be a sub-pilot within that, providing even greater resources for devices that could help children.
Oh, I love that idea. And in fact, I think Doug Kelly had sent an email to me a couple of days ago when he saw the talk and was sharing some ideas. I think that that's just the sort of kind of creative thinking that could really help grow the success here. Almost anything will be important here, and I think that anything we can do to approach this from different levels is great.
Yeah, and you mentioned either subsidies or incentives for people who help shepherd these programs. And obviously CROs can be expensive, but the other major expense for a lot of startup companies are regulatory experts. They're cottage industries there too, where so-called experts and regulatory processes charge huge amounts of money to give companies advice on how they interface with the FDA. And I wonder if there's a pro bono opportunity there, where if you do something to help products that will help children, either get incentivized in some way, or maybe you don't charge these companies if you're in that business. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, it is so clear that, and some of the people I think in our think tank group, like Kurt Dossi and Ed Berger and a few others, just have so much a wealth of expertise, and it would be great if that level of expertise could be shared with so many device developers that would really make the difference between success and non-success. So I think some of the ideas people have had to create public-private partnerships or some sort of innovation zone for pediatric medical devices where access to high-quality advice is readily available and freely shared. It really does seem that competition does help in many ways to promote improvement, but at the same time, I think there are scenarios where we're really looking at a market failure, where we really have to kind of look at the problem in ways that are different from other things. And I think the more that people can kind of work together to share their tips and tricks and success stories and things, I think will really help all boats to rise.
I particularly like the way you've been able to bring stakeholders together, or the meeting you had in DC, and this concept of using Delphi or modified RAND methodologies to provide insight, and perhaps even use as parts of submissions when the data is not as voluminous as you might expect, might be necessary to get products across the finish line. I wonder if you can comment on the increasing role of consensus building as a science or a scientific supplement to data, and combined with patient-reported outcome data also, to allow you to get to the finish line with some of these products.
Yeah, I mean, oftentimes when you're writing a grant, you're really looking for a place to start. And, if some kind of interested group has developed a consensus statement saying that, this is the most important thing that needs to be addressed, boy, do those consensus statements really help propel grants forward from the first sentence. So yeah, I think that there's a huge role for that. And it is true, we are just oftentimes working in a data void because there's so few patients and statistical significance is hard to come by. That yeah, I think oftentimes, especially if it's a broad-based group that includes, NIH and regulators and CMS and that sort of thing, that I think that if people see that everyone's kind of pushing in the same direction and endorsing the same kind of concept, that really, I think, can help to secure grants.
Perfect. Well, this is really I just really enjoyed your talk, and I'm most grateful for our CERSI group for making this possible, and also to the approximately 250 unique participants that joined us. And as I mentioned, this will be available within a week on the UCSF-Stanford CERSI website. Chris, thanks so much for a wonderful talk, and I hope you have a great rest of the summer.
Thanks, you too. And thanks everyone for listening in. I really appreciate it.